everyone. Welcome to the Maryland Center for History and Culture's first virtual program of 2021. My name is Martha Osterbiel, and I'm thrilled to kick off our spring season with today's virtual dialogue about memory and memorialization as they relate to public monuments and song lyrics. Before we get started, I just want to take a moment to thank all of you for registering for today's program and tuning in live, and to extend a special thanks to those of you who made a donation upon registration. Your support allows us to continue providing virtual conversations like this one. We have a wonderful group of panelists who will be sharing their wisdom and expertise on this topic. And who better to steer this conversation than our very own Director of Education, David Armenti. David is a Baltimore City native who received his bachelor's in American History and American Studies from the University of Maryland, College Park. There, he studied the social history of the United States, focusing on its complex racial and ethnic dynamics. David also completed his Master's of Arts in Teaching at Loyola University, becoming a state certified social studies educator. Before joining MCHC, he served as a research archivist for the Maryland State Archives Legacy of Slavery project, documenting historical examples of resistance among enslaved African Americans in Maryland. He specializes in bringing our state's unique history to life using primary source collections to guide inquiry-based learning on topics such as Black history, labor and political organizing, and the civil rights movement. So without further ado, I'll pass the microphone over to David to introduce our guests and to get our conversation started.
Thank you so much, Martha, and echo your thanks to the public for tuning in with us. I am really honored to be joined by our guest today and really excited to learn and engage in this conversation with them. So our first guest that I'll introduce is Dr. Renee Ader, who holds a BA in Art History from Oberlin College, an MA in Art History from the University of Maryland, and PhD in Art History from the University of Maryland. She taught in the Department of Art History and Archaeology at the University of Maryland from September 2000 to her retirement in July 2017. Her research and writing has focused on the intersection of race, monument building, and national identity, including numerous essays on a wide range of public monuments, including the Unsung Founders Memorial at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, the African American Civil War Memorial in Washington, D.C., and the Boston Massacre Crispus Attucks Memorial in Boston, Massachusetts. Dr. Ader is currently researching, designing, and writing the digital project entitled Contemporary Monuments to the Slave Past: Race, Memorialization, Public Space, and Civic Engagement. So welcome to Dr. Ader. We also have Dr. Billy Coleman, who completed his PhD in history at the University College London and is the author of Harnessing Harmony, Music, Power, and Politics in the United States, 1788 to 1865, which was just published last year. His research on Confederate music and the politics of treason during the Civil War and the political origins of the Star-Spangled Banner also appear respectively in the Journal of Southern History and the Journal of the Early Republic. Previously, he was a postdoctoral research and teaching fellow with the Department of History at the University of British Columbia, a doctoral exchange scholar at Yale University, and has held teaching posts at Queen Mary University of London and University of Portsmouth. His current project, Making Music National in a Settler State, is exploring the transnational origins of national music in the United States, Canada, Australia, and New Zealand. So welcome to Dr. Coleman. Ada Pinkston is an artist, educator, and cultural organizer living and working in Baltimore, Maryland, where she is lecturer in art education at Towson University. Her work explores the intersection of imagined histories and socio-political realities on our bodies using performance, digital media, and mixed media sculptures and installations. Ada's work has been featured at a variety of spaces over the years, and she has been the recipient of numerous awards and fellowships. She is a 2020 Monument Lab Fellow and her project, Landmarked, explores new ways of activating the empty spaces left by the 48 Confederate monuments that have been removed. The project considers how we reframe public space to be more equitable and inclusive of all histories. The project centers on civic engagement, the voices of people of color, and historical memories that are often overlooked by dominant cultural narratives found in public school textbooks. In addition to her studio practice, she is co-founder of the Lab Bodies Performance Art Laboratory in Baltimore, Maryland. So welcome to Ada Pinkston. So I am, like I said, I'm very excited to engage in this conversation. All of our panelists are going to have our videos on now, and we're going to get started and jump right into it. So what I want to pose to our panelists to get us started with this conversation is try to establish a little historical perspective and also how you respectively got into this work and bring your different expertise to the table. So I'll start with Dr. Ader. Can you tell us a little bit about, when it comes to monument building, Confederate or not, what were some of the historical motivations? What were the purposes that some of these monuments and other public representations served?
David, thank you. So I think one, particularly since you raised the issue of Confederate monuments here, but also many of the monuments that were produced in the late 19th, early 20th century in the post-Civil War era are certainly about recognizing the Civil War in public space, but and particularly with Confederate monuments, it's about this reconstruction of the lost cause narrative. And this becomes really complicated, a narrative that is disputing the real causes of the Civil War, that wants to, in effect, see the Civil War. And we know this through the writings of people like David Blight, for example, but to champion this notion of the Civil War being really a fight between brothers, and that slavery gets displaced out of that memory work in the late 19th, early 20th century in the post-Civil War period. So I would say that monuments in general are very much tied to, often tied to national identity and shaping what that national identity discourse should be. Monument building in the 19th century was trying to, in particular, valorize the efforts on both sides of the Union and the Confederacy in public space. But monuments are often tied to the nation state. And this is something that I think is really important for us to keep in mind, that they have certain kinds of politics and certain kinds of ways in which we engage them. But they're often, when I say nation, I mean that in the broadest sense, that these monuments are sponsored by cities, by state governments, by civic organizations. So I'll stop there and let someone else also respond. I have a lot to say about that particular, what I think is happening in the late 19th century with monuments, but there is an enormous push to build monuments in a country that actually lacked monuments. And so the Civil War becomes one way of kind of populating public space during this time, during the late 19th, early 20th century.
Absolutely. And, you alluded to, the motivations as related to the Civil War, but also some of who are those creators and what were the organizations behind them is a really interesting aspect. And we're not just talking about monuments, we're talking about different public representations. So Dr. Coleman, I don't know if you want to dive in and talk a little bit about how, like monuments, lyrics and songs also played a role in that nation state building and identity.
Sure, yeah, and I'll just jump in on one point that Renee was saying in terms of populating the space. And one of the interesting things about the Civil War and post-Civil War period is that it's following this sort of initial, once the nation starts by pulling down monuments, right? By pulling down monuments to King George III, and people are quite happy about that. And there is, a Republican thread that you can see that is relatively anti-monument, right? That we don't want to have, monuments put up to, federal officials, right? This is not something we want. We want to have a nation of farmers and all this kind of thing. And so there is a kind of shift that is going on at around about the Civil War. But in terms of song lyrics, I think one of the interesting things that I have written about a little bit is how music and cultural expressions during the Civil War lay the groundwork for a lot of this lost cause framework afterwards. So a song like Maryland, My Maryland is a song that is, written about it's a pro-Confederate song, a song, written with Confederate sympathies, criticizing the idea that this so-called union that is meant to be for liberty and freedom is also this Lincoln administration that is, taking away habeas corpus in Baltimore because of pro-secessionist mobs. And they had this sense that, we had this great kind of idea, and the Union is, holding this state back, and that Maryland will eventually come back to us. And it is laying the basis for the idea that this, conflict is rooted in us, in a kind of sense of the Confederate cause being a sense of victimhood, right? A sense that we do not have the freedom to say what we want or do what we want. And when, Union soldiers in Baltimore or in St. Louis or in New Orleans and all these occupied places try to police cultural expressions of Confederate patriotism, they find it really difficult because they're trying to reconcile this ideal that they are a representative of liberty, right? But that is hard to square with the idea that they're going to arrest women and children as well as men for singing Confederate songs that are essentially, as far as Confederates are concerned, forms of patriotism, right? That this is a patriotism that they claim, if you look at some of their founding documents and so on, that is actually the real representation of the American Revolution, right? That this is the patriotism and that the Union has lost their way. And it's a way of deflecting, the deeper causes of what this Civil War was all about by making that claim. But in trying to police that, they end up in this situation where they can't easily destroy Confederate sentiment without giving it a sense of legitimacy at the same time, because it's this idea that it is a patriotic expression, and patriotic expressions are supposed to be respectable and moral, and we're not in the business of telling people what to think and all this kind of stuff. And so that initial kind of bringing together of those two forces arguably paves the way for the fact that reconciliationist narratives trying to punish people for treason after the war are very difficult, and even potentially through into today, when you basically have these arguments about what is a patriotic expression when it comes to a song or a monument, and who gets to decide what is the proper way of being a real patriotic American citizen. And then that sort of power dynamic is really what's at play.
Absolutely. And I do want to circle back to this topic. You said talking about it today. Well, it's almost literally talking about it today in the case of Maryland, My Maryland, where we have that debate and bills going through the legislature currently, and certainly not the first time that Maryland has tried to address that. So I do want to get back to that piece and dive into it a little bit more deeply. But I'd like to hear from Ada, thinking more from the artist and the kind of reinterpretive perspective. What is it about these relics, whether they be monuments or song lyrics, but I think particularly the physical manifestations in different public spaces, what is it about those that people feel connected to, and how do we kind of take that energy and reinterpret it, and maybe alluding to some of the work that you've done in recent years.
I think that creative production or cultural production is really important, generally speaking, because it can communicate, and it can reach an audience or provide a group of people with a sense of sensory experiences that move someone in a deep emotional matter, right? And I wanted to go back to what Renee was talking about the construction of the nation state and how it relates to monuments, because I think it's really important to think about the construction of the nation state of the US as it relates to colonialism, right? And, I think we have a tendency, so the Civil War, like even now, right? What we're experiencing in this moment, we're not in a vacuum, right? So the 19th century construction of monuments were very much tied to the construction of whiteness, right? Just as the construction of whiteness is something that I think fueled the motivation for colonial land grabs that happened across the United States and around the world. So, I mean, if we look at stolen objects, right? Or monuments that are destroyed in other parts of the world, like we can look at Benin as an example or as a case study of that, right? I think that, so that was happening at the same time that all of these monuments, or also in indigenous societies in the US, right? All of these monuments were destroyed and stolen and are in museums, right? And I want to bring out that juxtaposition between the stolen objects and what is considered a monument or memorial with the construction of the nation state that we are currently experiencing now. But yeah, so I mean, and I think that the fact that monuments and cultural production is oftentimes that these objects are stolen, I think that they also speak to the importance of the visual, the aesthetic experience, and how much that really illustrates and helps to create and evolve a society. And I have to say, actually, let me stop it there, because I was going to talk about truth and reconciliation and how that never happened. And we're currently living in that moment as well. So.
Absolutely. Yeah. We'll definitely circle back to that concept of reconciliation and, to the extent that it actually occurred. But I think it's really important, that framing that you just mentioned, that this is not just about the Civil War. It's kind of a larger project related to nation building, tied to white supremacy, and that these were not, what Dr. Ader mentioned earlier, these were not empty spaces always. There may have been those cultural products from either indigenous groups of people or those in colonized areas, even outside of the Americas. So I think that's really important. But getting, so bringing that back around, what were some of these organizations? What were some of the groups that were engaging in this work of, we're saying, kind of building out these spaces and finding different representations? Because I think certainly looking at the Civil War particularly, it was not an equitable process, let's say. So who were those organizations? Who were those creators? And how did they go about this work?
Can I just jump in?
Sure.
Yeah. So one of the things I think that I'm actually fascinated with is how many women's groups are directly engaged in commissioning monuments during the late 19th, 20th century. And they oftentimes people want to kind of defang the power that these women had. And I would actually like to say these women, both Union women who were supporting Union troops, but Confederate women did have a lot of power to determine what those public spaces looked like. They were groups, Kirk Savage does a really good job of talking in his book on race and monument building about the role of particularly of Southern women groups of reshaping public space and wanting to memorialize their kin basically in those public spaces. And they were savvy. I mean, and I think, and I will look very locally to Alexandria, Virginia, where these women were savvy enough to get it written into the state constitution to make it nearly impossible to remove the Confederate soldier that sat in South Washington State, the Appomattox statue, which has since been removed, but required an amendment in order for it to be removed in Alexandria. So I think women's groups are really important to keep in mind. They raised the money oftentimes for these monument buildings. So they were, and they did it in their women's circles by raising money. The other groups who are very much invested in this, of course, are civic organizations, cities, for example. So I think I think back to, example of Boston and their statue to Crispus Attucks was a civic group that actually was initiated, I should be really careful about that, was initiated by African Americans in Boston. This attempt to memorialize African American participation in the Revolutionary War, not the Civil, but the Revolutionary War. And eventually that effort is actually taken over by white civic leaders. So I think Ada's comment, and I think Billy also is getting at this, is that most of these monuments that are created, it really is about whiteness and the celebration of a certain kind of whiteness in public space. So if anyone else wants to jump in, I'll pause and let Billy, if Billy and Ada want to also respond to that.
I won't add too much there, only just to jump on and say that, I mean, women's groups were very much behind pushes to adopt the Star Spangled Banner as the national anthem from all different parts of the country. The link, just to touch on this briefly, the link between music and colonization and race is interesting. Yeah, so there are, if you want to find a, official song of a United States nation, right, a kind of, if you want to sort of distinguish between a musical relic and a musical monument, right, something that has some kind of official sanction, that is almost always a genre that is based in some kind of European tradition, right? And it is defining sonic space in terms of its national connections and nation building connections in that racialized way. And that is just something to bear in mind when we think about, what songs are meant to be patriotic, right? Or what monuments are meant to be patriotic, and on and on and on. So.
Yeah, and I think what you're saying is a good point, right? Because again, like the whole colonial project created the racial constructions that we're existing in today, right? So whiteness is an imaginary. It's not, this is something, but it still has material consequences that we see in public space, like Renee said, or that we see in other, services not being distributed or, yeah. So I see that David is about to say something. Go ahead.
I didn't need to, but yeah, definitely. I want our panelists to all talk more than I do. So please don't feel that I'm interjecting. But one of the things that I did want to touch on within that, Renee mentioned the example from Boston. Several of us are either tuning in from Maryland or have some of our work grounded in Maryland, and the idea of women's groups contributing to this project and having a major voice in the process. Particularly in Baltimore, we have one of the 4 monuments that were taken down in recent years was the Confederate Women's Monument on University Parkway. One of those things I walked by probably 100 times as a kid and never knew exactly what it was. But I I certainly want to dig a little bit into what makes Maryland such a unique context. So this was something that was going on all across the nation, of course. Dr. Coleman alluded to Maryland and Baltimore's role within the Civil War. But what is it about Maryland, whether they be spaces in Baltimore or even some of the rural districts of Maryland, that makes it a unique place for these developments and conversations to take hold?
I don't mean to keep going first, but I'm going to jump in again. I do think Maryland is unusual because it's a border state. And so it's a state that has both Confederate and Union interests during the Civil War, which puts it at odds. It has a long history of the Underground Railroad coming out of the eastern shore of Maryland. And we know that decade-long legacy, of course, of Harriet Tubman, but she's not the only person to leave out of Cambridge, right out of Dorchester County. And Frederick Douglass's long association with Maryland. So I think the fact that you have two of the kind of heroes of the Underground Railroad, Frederick Douglass and Harriet Tubman, tied to Maryland is really important. And so that landscape, particularly on the Eastern Shore, has become memorialized in some very interesting ways in the past decades as part of these kind of cultural heritage tourism and the way in which people move through the landscape. I think Baltimore is also a really fascinating city, like as this pivotal point of being a border city where there are Confederates and Union and enslaved and free Blacks living in Baltimore. So there's a very unusual combination that's happening. And I'm not a historian of Maryland per se, but I've read a lot about the history of Maryland, and that makes it stand out. And the fact that it is so close, like it's right there next to Delaware and Pennsylvania, is also really, it's not Alabama, right? So this makes it a very different, a kind of different location. But I do think that there was always this conflict between the slave owners of Maryland and those abolitionists who wanted a different vision of Maryland, a different vision of Baltimore. And I know, Ada, your work ties like into this, and I'd be curious what your thoughts on this as well. I see the two comments, and I want to come back to both Clinton Daly as well as the Vivian Barnett, who suggested Sarah Beetham's article, which is fantastic. If you want a history of the Confederate monuments and how women's groups are involved, and that's a very good essay to read. So and Clinton Daly, I'm going to come back to your question later on when we get to that phase.
Yeah, no, I mean, it's interesting too, because another thing that I forgot to mention was that the Confederate daughters are really interested in and engaged in school boards, right? And thinking through how to continue the narrative in the school textbook, right? Continue the narrative of the art object, or the architectural object that's in public space in relationship to these lessons, right? That in a lot of ways really did inform the way that the public considers the Confederate legacy, right? But it's also, and as we keep saying this, right? Like all of these monuments were built at the height of Jim Crow, or the height of the Jim Crow moment in time. And I think that also is really important to think about when we think about the relationship that the story of Baltimore City has to all of this, right? Because it was a space where there was so much Black autonomy, and how do these structures of Jim Crow, like for instance, redlining, how does that transform the city, right? And how does that, how does the physical architectural form of the Confederate monument impact all of it, right? But yeah, so the performative work that I do is about, like, I'm seeing it more as like a time traveling situation, and I'm more interested in thinking through, like, what are the narratives that have been glossed over and ignored by most dominant historical accounts. So the performance that I did on top of the Confederate monument that was removed outside of the BMA, the Robert E. Lee plaque, that was literally, I was thinking about Fannie Lou Hamer. I was thinking about her, and I was thinking about how, like, why aren't there any monuments to Fannie Lou? And how do we get, what would it look like to have her voice emanating throughout public spaces, or to see her voice and to see her agency and her autonomy throughout public space. So yeah, but there's also another component is these workshops. And obviously because of the pandemic, like I can't really go outside and set up these pieces of paper as I could 2 years ago, but it's an ongoing project. And I'm really interested in thinking about, or thinking through how to get, or what is at the core, like how does the general public today even respond to the form of the monument, and what does it mean to consider memory more deeply, yeah, outside of all of these structures and lattices of systems, right, that were created to develop a very specific narrative that maintained this white construction in Maryland and beyond.
Definitely. And that point about the lost cause narrative almost being concurrent and in conjunction with the strengthening of Jim Crow and white supremacy in communities. And you mentioned redlining. They're bookending two of the monuments built in Baltimore, Spirit of the Confederacy in 1903 and the Confederate Women's Monument in 1917. Right in the middle of there, Baltimore is the city that has pioneered a housing segregation law from its city council that states and cities and even internationally tried to replicate this Baltimore plan, or the West Law as it sometimes was called. So these things, in an earlier point of yours, these things did not happen in a vacuum, right? They were part of that larger colonial project, but also more specifically this post-war era, and thinking about meaning and identity in those public spaces.
David, could I just respond a little bit to Ada really quickly? Because there's something that, this idea of public space and who has access to public space, that I think redlining is really part of that. And so we end up with this idea, we have a mythology around public space that it's accessible to all. And what I see is that public space is not accessible to all. There's serious policing of public space. And because of that, those monuments are in those spaces oftentimes where there's policing around who gets to be there, and let's say have a barbecue or have a drink or sit there and communicate with each other in these public spaces. And so one of the things I think happens particularly, and I see some of it actually in the contemporary moment, is that we can reshape these public space, but they have so much already tangible, like historical, what's the thing I'm getting at? They have all this stuff kind of hanging on the public space, right? Whether it's racism, whether it's police conflict, whether it's segregation. And so then, in fact, our public spaces are not public spaces. I've been thinking about this really hard because I think that this notion of exclusion is essential to monument building. Like that seems to me one of its components, unfortunately. And I do see that there's something about Black artists and communities designing monuments. And I think that is going on and we should talk about that. But I do think there's limitations, right? Often to public art and to the spaces in which it's put. So Ada, I was just thinking about some of the things you were saying, and I just wanted to respond to that.
Yeah, because there's a residue, right? It's an ongoing residue like that happens, regardless, right? It's on a molecular level, right? Like I think Billy was talking about the sonic relationship that we have to sound, right? Or like how does the sonic space interact with the construction of a story? And I think that the sonic space does exist in the air too, right? Yeah.
It was, that point was just making me think of how, there is in some ways a tension, right? If you put a monument in public space, but part of a goal of people who take the initiative or who bother to, put a monument there is to enforce a certain idea onto the people who take it away, right? Like they can't necessarily control what people take away, but there is a certain sense that it is, if you put a monument there, it's going to define what, you know, patriotism means. So I'm thinking like Fort McHenry. So like Fort McHenry is essentially made part of the National Park Service sometime in the 1920s, I think. So sort of out of this patriotic spirit of World War I and people wanting to kind of enforce, you know, this is when more statues are going up. And the language they use to label it is amazing, right? It's a historic shrine and national monument. It's like both things. And to call Fort McHenry that, you know, it links this idea that, you know, we are going to historically enshrine not only whiteness, but specifically like a military whiteness, because this is a military place that we're going to preserve, and then, you know, only, you know, the people that can get there will interpret it in the ways that we sort of start to shape for them, right? Part of, you know, monuments is often about a sense of patriotism where you need to improve the citizenry, and you need to make them better and appreciate the proper things and the right way of going about things. That is just strikes me as at odds with the very concept of, you know, what Renee is saying, like with a public space.
And somebody brought this up in the Q&A, and I was reminded too, Dr. Ader, when you brought up the point of policing and this mythology around spaces, the Lee, and Ada too, the Lee Jackson Monument is in what is essentially a public space. But at the same time, we're having this conversation about Johns Hopkins University and its conflict with the surrounding community and whether an increased police presence is needed from that institution for some of those surrounding spaces. So I can see that that kind of idea intersecting there. And furthermore, one of the earlier points that about some of the people that should be honored in these spaces. Well, that park has since been, or at least a portion of it has since been renamed after Harriet Tubman. So these efforts are ongoing, but I think there are those kind of multiple dynamics that are at play that we don't necessarily put together. So I'm glad that you brought up that point. And I will allow, you know, if anybody else wants to continue that thread, but it did also remind me, Dr. Ader, of a wonderful conversation you led in Easton, Maryland, with some teachers with us a couple years ago outside of the Talbot County Courthouse. So I think that's another really instructive example of this public space mythology and what kind of juxtapositions can exist. So if anybody wants to respond to the other piece, go ahead. But I think that's another context, at least here in Maryland, where we can analyze a bit more.
Well, and I think down in Talbot County, you know, I had a graduate student who wrote a really, really smart paper about the conflict when they commissioned the Frederick Douglass, and it really toward this community. So the other thing that I think we haven't quite talked about, but is that community's engagement with monument building in the present moment. And in Talbot County, it kind of, quite frankly, unfurled or it opened up all of this race stuff that had not been dealt with, right, for how many years in that particular city. And one of the most fascinating things is that the student who wrote this paper ended up going down there and said, I have like touched a can of worms, because there was an African-American group that was really pushing for this Frederick Douglass. It makes sense that there be some kind of memorialization to Frederick Douglass in Talbot County and down there. And then to put it on the town square, right, or on the courthouse square, and that really contentious space, right, where the courthouse is with the Confederate monument. And they voted not to, I believe, remove the Confederate monument recently. And so it will stay there, the Talbot boys. And so there's this, in that sense, a really uneasy tension that is realized in that space between the actually quite well done monument to Frederick Douglass and the Talbot boys, and this dialogue that doesn't quite happen. So we can do corrective monument building. We can put stuff by side, but it doesn't always work. And one of the things I see in this, I actually want to address this as part of what I'm saying. Someone said, well, maybe should we start with education? Yes, we should start with education in schools. Oftentimes I feel like we build a monument before we've actually done kind of the historical conversation and the really deep historical conversation we need to have around monument building. And I don't think there should just be a rush to populate our landscape with monument building, because you know what's going to happen in 50 years? A whole nother generation is going to ask why we created these memorials and what is their meaning. And I think that's something we have to work really, really hard at thinking about in the future. And Ada, I'm really fascinated that you're part of the Monument Lab fellowships and that whole kind of push to rethink like the conceptually what a memorial or monument is and how we deal with that. And I thought, Billy, your point too about, and I think that this idea of sound and the way it like plays into all of this, you know, I was recently, and this is a little bit aside, but I was at a recent memorial here in DC that's dedicated to Native American service members. And they have chosen to actually play the indigenous music in the background. So you're experiencing the memorial. It was really fascinating at the National Museum of American Indian through the soundscape, right? So it wasn't just the circle that's plopped down there, but we're listening to the songs that are dedicated to the fallen warriors. And that's a very powerful experience, actually, to have a multi-sensory experience and not just the bronze things stuck in space. Sorry, I can talk on it.
Yeah, that just reminds me of like one of the amazing things about music in this context is, and it's not the only medium that does this, but its emphasis on the capacity for repetition and the connection of the idea of repetition to remembering, and that you can sort of play these songs over and over again, and you can keep remembering things in different ways. And, you know, repetition within songs as well, and how, you know, a lot of memorialization is, you know, a process of trying to, you know, have a collective reckoning with a traumatic event, and how music can play into that through just repetition itself, in a way that is just sometimes more accessible to people's minds than other mediums that, you know, also are going to involve repetition too. But yeah.
Yeah, and Renee, I mean, right. So there's a whole cohort of folks, right? We're all a part of this moment of artists across the world really reconsidering memory and how to uplift memories that are often ignored through performances, through, I mean, a lot of people are talking about 3D printing. I'm working on an augmented reality project commemorating the life of Biddy Mason in Los Angeles, whose story is very tied to Los Angeles. So I think that, you know, and there's quite a few other groups that are thinking through how do we use technology, like the crowd, you know, the crowd source or the crowd conversation of technology to create spaces for the public to engage with the memory ongoing in an ongoing way. But, you know, one of the things that I'm coming up with as I'm developing this work is sometimes, you know, when we look at coded bias, for instance, right? Like sometimes technology fails us. And that's the one thing, you know, that I'm a bit leery of, right? So, and sometimes it's better to think through like what are like to go back to those senses, right? The sound, the vision, the smell, to put the public, the audience on a more holistic experience of memory. But yeah.
I think that's really important, and the idea of crowdsourcing and the artist and activist community taking the reins here in this modern moment really is counter. You know, we brought up earlier about who were some of the initial creators. Well, you know, maybe there were women's groups, there were veterans groups, but I think, and also Dr. Coleman has talked about, what the purpose of song making in those early years too, that we're really kind of countering now some of those original purposes and bringing more people into the conversation, which is really important. So we are at 12:45. I want to get through a couple more concepts here, but also start to think about what some of the people in the public are asking and wanting to learn more about your work and your thoughts about this. So I still think the idea of reimagining and recontextualizing these spaces, what are some of the different ways that we can do that, that have been effective, let's say? So Dr. Ader, I know you brought up some examples of ways that maybe didn't work, whether it be the Talbot Boys and Frederick Douglass, or some of the other representations that you've seen. But whether it be through monuments or other representations, what have been some successful examples, or at least examples where conversation started to move in the right direction?
Well, I think Ada's work is really important. So I think I'm actually to be honest, most interested in some of the things that Ada was talking about, performance, about the use of maybe AR. There's a woman artist, and there's some really interesting Black woman artists doing this kind of monumental intervention work. So I think that's important to say explicitly. There's Becky Davis in Rhode Island, and she has been doing all of these, like reactivating the space. So she took a very famous statue of Burnside, for example, and had a day where Black women could come and they had their hair braided. Like, she completely transformed the space into something else, into a space that was about community and neighborhood. I think, Ada, your work, I think of Indira Allegra's work out in Oakland, who's also trying to really force us to think hard, for example, about police brutality, with her use of weaving and particularly choosing, let's say, materials that are used in police uniforms in her work, right? So reweaving this particular kind of material to talk about police brutality. And so I do think there's some very, like, internationally and also locally really exciting things that are happening around, like, what I would call the ephemeral nature of monument building, that we could actually do lots of kind of interventions that don't have to last forever, right? That can have this moment and then be recorded or experienced by those who were part of that performance. And I think that's really important as a not a solution, but one way to think about memorialization in the future, is this kind of ephemeral event that can take place.
Yeah, that, and also, like, so much of Black and Indigenous cultures, right, have been ephemeral for decades, right? Like, we can look at Carnival, we can look at Mardi Gras, we can look at go-go music in DC, right? Like, we can, so much of cultural production, or like the performance element of Black cultural production, is ephemera, and is in that way, right, related to the memory of West African rhythms, right? But I also, my work is ephemeral, but then I also know that it's also important to have public space that is inclusive, right? And there is a woman based in New York who has been making very, like, realistic images of Black figures in bronze and casting them in bronze. I'm gonna remember her name after I finish talking, but I think it's also important, like, as we're in this moment of reckoning, right, to also have a space, or to consider, like, okay, we're in this moment of reckoning where people are really being more conscious about what are the architectural objects, or how do we think through a more inclusive story, right? So I think it's important at this moment to really make it inclusive, right? Like, permanently, because, for instance, there's only, I don't know, something like 2% of monuments across the United States that recognize women, right? And I think, yeah, so I'll just leave that there.
I think you're talking about Vinnie Bagwell in New York City, who does a lot of bronze monuments, and she's creating an interesting rain garden that's dedicated to slavery. She was in that kind of kerfuffle with Simone Lee in New York. I think
Exactly. That's, yes. Yes, she is. And, you know, I think she was the one that said it, right? She was like, why is it now people don't want to have the form, this bronze form anymore?
Mm.
Which I think is important to think about, right? Like, and not to say, you know, but, or I don't think it's mutually exclusive. I think it's all of the things can happen. They can coexist. But yeah.
And I just wanted to say, because I see there's a lot of questions about CSA monuments. I mean, I can be really super explicit for the questions that keep cropping up around this. First of all, go read the Southern Poverty Law Center's report on Confederate monuments. They did a whole documentation about why they were created, and they are instruments of control. And I think we really need to understand that many of these monuments went up into public space in the 20s and 30s and 40s as a system of control of Black communities. And we know this because they were not solely in memory of their deceased soldiers. Everyone has a right to have those kinds of memories. But when they're used in ways as a reminder of what kind of white power, this is super problematic. This is why we are at this moment of people wanting them to have removed, or of there being a desecration of monuments, because they symbolize kind of white supremacy. And this is really, really important for us to keep in mind. They are not objects that were just kind of randomly put into space. They were freighted, right, with ideological meaning. So I see these questions, there's been several of them around Confederate monuments and that power, but they're tied to, in some ways, of wanting to keep Blacks in their place. And I've kind of hijacked, I'll stop talking.
Yeah, no,
No,
I
that
think it's
was-
important.
that was-
Yeah.
Go ahead, Ada. I'm sorry.
I was going to say it's important because I also see a lot of the same question. It's important to even, because there's a graphic in there that shows the years that most of these monuments were made. And also, Robert E. Lee wasn't really interested in maintaining this division, right? So like, why are people so focused on maintaining it, or maintaining this narrative? He was not interested in even seeing the Confederate flag. But yeah.
And I think this is also a good moment to mention that we're going to capture all of these resources for our registrants and try to summarize as best as we can, whether that's additional readings or projects that are ongoing from our panelists or other folks that have been mentioned, because certainly we're not answering all of the questions today, and a lot of scholarship has gone into these examinations before, particularly that alignment between white supremacy, segregation, and the effort to get these symbols in public spaces. And that also relates to music and other representations. So at this point, I will take a few direct questions from our Q&A, a few of which have already been addressed. But let's see. We do have a question about using these items that have been removed for education or to be put into museums. What, if any, do our panelists have thoughts about, whether it's a monument or whether it's something that can be archived? The thought about putting either Confederate monuments into a museum, or what actually could be done with them in these instances.
Well, I have pretty strong feelings about this. I think it's and part of it's the economics of how museums work. By putting an object into a museum that has to be valued for insurance and taken care of in the long term. So for me, it's a real issue of, by putting these objects into museums, we're actually giving them value. And I think that's important for us to think about how museums operate, how they operate within the context of the market and economics. And so you have to do all sorts of things. You actually have to put a value on that, a monetary value onto an object. And then you have to get insurance for that object. So unless you just have things in your collection, you're not going to have covered by insurance. So there's a whole series of ways in which I'm not sure it's as effective to have these in museums. I do think that some reclaiming of these, that some of these objects can go into cemeteries. I have less issues with that, with objects being put into cemeteries. I have bigger issues around kind of white supremacist activities around these objects, which also still happen. But I do think that there's been some suggestions to do, and I think this is somewhere, in Russia, where they took all the statues of Lenin and plopped them in a park. And if you want to go look at them, you can go to one location and they're all there. So that's just several ways of doing. But I think this idea that we're just going to relabel everything, and somehow if you give it a better historical context through a good label, that is not, and I can tell you, I have a student who worked on a project in Atlanta. It's not working. And the texts were kind of overcorrective. And so I think that's an issue of how we do this reinterpretation. And much of this work needs to happen in our curriculum. It's as simple as that. These histories and diverse histories that we need to tell need to happen at the elementary and high school level.
Yeah, and also I think I want to bring it back to the imaginary, right? Like, whiteness is an imaginary, period. It's not, this is something that was constructed specifically at a moment in the past of humanity that that needed to reconcile the ways that imperialism was happening, right? European imperialism was happening. So it's not, so I actually have like one dream is to put these monuments in a museum on the construction of whiteness, which is like, I'm like, maybe it could all go there. And then that museum has a lot of pedagogical tools to talk through the construction of whiteness. Because this idea of or the imaginary of white supremacy isn't real either, right? Like it was also constructed, and then these systems of laws were created to maintain the imaginary, right? And it's right now we're at a moment in time where we have to move forward past this, because if we look at, the way that humans interact with the environment, it's not sustainable, right? And the way that we and different nation states throughout the world interact with the environment, because of the construction of whiteness and because of the residue of imperialism and colonialism, it's all interconnected. But Renee, I think that you're bringing up other countries' examples of how to reconcile figures or moments, historical moments that no longer serve the present day construction of a country. Like Germany, for instance, they have a whole, in Berlin, or a little bit outside of Berlin, they have a museum for all of the dictators and fascists, right? Now Hitler is not included in that, but it's a space but Germany has done a lot of different things to really make sure that this particular moment of fascism doesn't happen again. But that's a whole other story, I know. But anyways, but yes, I think that there's a lot that can be done with these memories that can help us not forget, so that we don't replicate the same moments. Again, we can look at January 6th as an example of this. And it's actually astonishing to me that these hearings that are happening are not being broadcast currently. There's hearings about what happened January 6th. But I think this is all interconnected. Again, back to this, we're not, and it's a cyclical, these moments are all cyclical. There's no, it's all interconnected. But with that, I'll let somebody else go.
Well, unfortunately, we are at the end of our hour. I think, it's safe to say that this conversation could go on forever. And because it's so intertwined with so many different aspects of our history and the way that our nation is constructed. So I'm sad to put a stop to this conversation, but we are out of time. I want to thank our wonderful panelists and David for moderating today's conversation. We're really grateful for your time and perspective on this complex topic. And thanks to everyone who tuned in to listen and to learn. As a reminder, one of the benefits of being a member of the Maryland Center for History and Culture is priority registration to our programs and to exclusive member-only events. You can visit our website at mdhistory.org to check out our benefits and to sign up. And I also want to mention, in correlation with today's program, our education department is hosting a virtual teacher workshop on Saturday, March 6th at noon to highlight instructional resources and primary source material to support discussions on this topic, which can be very difficult to address in the classroom. So David and some other colleagues will be leading that professional development program, which is free and open to all. And again, you can register through our website at mdhistory.org. David, do you have any final remarks?
Well, I hate to be the one to give the final remarks, but definitely for any teachers or folks that know teachers in the room, I think that topic of education came up a couple times, that we need to equip, especially our K-12 folks, to build up our students to be active participants in this sort of civic engagement. So I'm looking forward to that. And also the fact that this is an ongoing project. Reconciliation around these topics has not been completed nearly at all. So we need our scholars, our artists, our educators, and our students to continue moving us forward. So that is all going to continue to be intertwined. But thank you so much to everybody for joining us and our wonderful panelists.
Thank you. We hope to see you at another program soon, and take care.
Thank you.